Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to talk about the very niche and frankly the very dull subject of one bay NAS. A number of you who have come into the world of network attached storage, maybe because you're moving away from a cloud provider like Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever, or you're just looking for a simple way to back up all of your devices as easy as possible. You're not looking for the big beastie bells and whistles of all the other devices. All you want is a really simple device. Maybe you've got an old hard drive knocking around in your home. Maybe you're just looking to move away from the USB flash sticks that are knocking around in that drawer, and you look at a one bay NAS because you think, I don't want to spend a lot of money. I want something that's just going to sit there and do the job, and I never want to have to look at it again. Okay, so one bay NASs certainly have a place in the wider infrastructure of server solutions. Indeed, when you look at a lot of the hardware that's being developed all the time, very few tiers of network attached storage have seen the innovation and kind of evolution that one bay NASs have been. There was a time when one bays were kind of overlooked as a kind of waste of time, and a lot of manufacturers did almost no real effort towards developing them because as far as they were concerned, one, it was easier to make a 2-bay, and two, a single hard drive didn't really put out the performance that would justify making any extra effort or time into evolving it. But now we see a lot more efficient CPUs arriving on the market, innovations in ARM or ARM processors, and we're seeing hard drives exceed that of 200, 250, 260, and even 270 megabytes per second. And therefore, a single hard drive is no longer the bottleneck that it used to be. Now, of all of the brands, of course, in terms of network attached storage, Synology and QNAP, in terms of one bays definitely, but also in 2s and 4s and even 8-bay desktop devices, kind of corner the market. And right now, at the time of recording in September 2021, right now there are 4 main one bays on the market. And although this video is kind of, I'm going to call it a guide, because I'm going to talk about the benefits and indeed the disadvantages of one bays in general, it's worth highlighting that really when it comes to one bays right now until a new release comes along, these are really your only one bay options. Of course, there are ones like WD's one bays and stuff like that, but the reason I don't include them in this comparison is I don't consider them fully featured one bays. They lack a lot of the bells and whistles that modern NAS buyers do look for, and therefore we're just focusing on these 4. So they are the DS118. Again, the DS118 from Synology has been knocking around for quite a while. I mean, again, I'm impressed it's still around today, and whether it's because Synology are waiting on the architecture behind the Realtek CPU series that we'll talk about later on evolving, the DS118 that I think arrived on the scene in 2017-18 has been around a while, and it's 2021 now. After that, there is the more modern release, and by the way, modern is the only word I'm going to use in the terms of release, at least in the rest of the architecture, is the DS120J, part of their very much affordable series of devices. If the 118 was value, the DS120J, unfortunately you'd use the words like cheap, or we're just going to use the word affordable. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got QNAP as well. Now, where I say the other end of the spectrum because both of these companies have always seemingly prioritised hardware or software. They've got better at it, but they're definitely not 50-50 companies. Synology seem to be 60% software, 40% hardware, and QNAP is generally 60% hardware, 40% software. But in the case of these two releases, things are slightly different. The TS131K, arguably the better in most ways of the two one bays from QNAP there. The TS131K is a one bay heavily stylized on the affordable 2s and the 4 bays. It's one of the only one bays I've ever seen with a removable tray, which, stop and think for a moment, what a waste of time that is. It's not like you're going to hot swap that drive, are you? You pull that drive out, knackered. On top of that, you've got the other more modern released TS130. It's got kind of baby blue, very discreet chassis. I believe it's the smallest NAS of all of these. It's also top loaded with the drive standing vertically. Inside there, there's no hot swap bay. Again, pointless. And these are our 4 one bays. Okay, so let's go through them straight away. The first thing that a lot of people are going to buy a one bay for, and again, I'm talking to you, the console owner that just wants to have your own private media server, or you, the person that wants to add a tier of backup to your existing data storage strategy and just want one drive living somewhere synchronized there in the background. It's going to be price, because you don't want to spend a lot on this system. If you were looking at a one bay to start with, you were already not looking to break the bank. There are other reasons people buy one base, like power consumption, that I'll talk about later on, but predominantly price is a big factor. And between all of these, by a country mile, the cheapest one, the DS120J, arriving at $99 or £89 or 199 Canadian dollars there. Again, euros I try to include, but the problem with adding euros is the prices are so diverse and they fluctuate all the time. So I'm sticking with these three for now, but I'm pretty sure you can work out a decent enough average from those. Now, that is by far the lowest price of all of them, but the best value when looking at all of these, I'm erring towards the DS118. It's the oldest of the four, and I think its age is what keeps its price what it is. It knocking around for about $199, £179 or 299 Canadian dollars. That device there is arguably the best value of these four. Very close, I would say, to both the TS131K and the TS130. Both of those knocking around for 220 and 140 respectively. Now that 220 seems a little high. It will become a little clearer later on where that price tag stems from, but still nonetheless, in terms of price, if you want to save a bit of bunts, definitely the 120J. And if you're looking for the best value between all of these, and again, value isn't just hardware, it's hardware, software, and as an overall package, the Synology DS118 takes the value. Now, when we talk about things like value, we're talking about what we get for our money, what we put in and what we get out. Now, in the case of these, predominantly when it comes to hardware, we will look at the CPU and the memory. These are, after all, effectively just like the computers that you may or may not be watching this video on. If you're watching it from a sofa at home, good for you. Have another sweetie. But the CPU and the memory inside these is similar, but it's the first time I've ever looked at a comparison with four different NASes on the screen, and they're all different. Okay, so all of them take advantage of ARM-based processors, ARM-based processors. These are CPUs that are designed around the idea of using as little power as possible. Now, if you're with your mobile phone, tablets and stuff like that, they predominantly use ARM-based processors. The reason is that these are things that are running on a battery. They're not running from mains power predominantly. They are devices that are going to be utilized on the go or portable, or are designed to be on for extended lengths of time, and therefore they can't be too egregious about the power they utilize. Now, a normal processor, an x86 64-bit processor, commands are handed to a CPU which then actions those commands. Now, it uses a certain amount of power in order to do those. That's your clock, your frequency, and again, that's an oversimplification, I know. In the case of ARM-based processors, an element of compression takes place where the command is made smaller, and therefore it can handle more commands, utilizing less power. There's more to it than that, but that's predominantly the case. However, ARM-based processors can't really take advantage of incredibly complex tasks. Huge visual constructions, graphical-based enabling stuff. If you've ever used a Chromebook or played a game on a non-graphically embedded phone, one, Tegra chip and all that stuff, what you end up with is the CPU going nuts, your phone getting really, really hot, and your battery just going. So all of these use ARM-based processors, but in different ways. So starting again at the 118, that utilises arguably the best CPU on the table today. It takes advantage of the Realtek RTD1296, an incredibly popular processor in servers, in Raspberry Pi utilization, and low, small, portable devices. The Realtek RT1296 is a quad-core 1.4 gigahertz processor that's ARM, but it's a 64-bit architecture chip, so it can do a number of things that its beefier, more aggressive x86 processors, like your Pentiums, like your AMDs and stuff like that, but it does it with utilizing less power. It also takes advantage of a transcoding engine on board, along with a hardware encryption engine, but the transcoding engine is really what we need to talk about, because that means it can reshape and reform 1080p and 4K files, which, if you're buying a NAS for multimedia, is very, very useful there. Now, that Realtek, you must have heard of it if you've looked at NAS even tentatively. It has appeared from all the brands, not just these two, but many, many others. All the way through to WD, they were one of the first to utilise transcoding 4K ARM processors. But that CPU, despite its age, because remember, this NAS came out 2017-18 series, it's still being utilised to this day. So again, they got there first, and Synology have really eked a lot of what this CPU can do as well out of it. Now, the next tier up, the DS120J, on the other hand, this uses an older generation CPU, but with improvements. It is a Marvel Armada, the 3700 CPU, and this is a dual-core 800 megahertz CPU. So straight away, you heard 800 megahertz and went, I'm sorry, what year is it? That's right, 800 megahertz is not a high frequency. This CPU is going to be working hard, doing even light tasks. That said, it is a 64-bit architecture processor. They've actually managed to use a 64-bit ARM processor, albeit in a dual-core 800 megahertz fashion, which is really, really right? So this CPU, although low rent, means it can still do quite a lot, definitely over its previous generations, and it even supports the DSM-7, which if you've looked it up, is a very slick-looking piece of software. Yes, that CPU is still pretty low, and it's going to have to work damn hard, but it will get the job done eventually. Now, if we move to the QNAP offerings there, the QNAP TS131K arrives with a 32-bit ARM-based processor, so again 32, much like the 120J, but it ramps things up significantly with a 4-core 1.7 gigahertz processor. So what it makes up for in a lesser efficiency over the ones we talked about, it brings more raw power to the table. It's that argument of speed versus acceleration, and getting things done quick and having a bit more horsepower there. It's just not going to utilize it with the slick efficiency and ration book mentality of the other two we've just talked about. Now, this CPU, not great for multimedia, it has to be said. File handling, if you're going to look at things like, easy and consistent file processing and lots of small jobs, that CPU is going to work very, very well. And the TS131K has clearly got a file handling mentality based on it. It's not really targeted that much in terms of multimedia, and although it does support all of the multimedia apps from QNAP, it's definitely erring more towards file handling than it is to multimedia. So as a backup, it's a great option, but not for you multimedia users. Now at the end, the TS130 there, that one has the real tech. It has a 64-bit ARM-based processor. It's the RTD12995. That's right. It's one little revision underneath the DS118. Now, there's a few things to unpack there. Firstly, the TS130 arrived in 2021, some years after the 118 there. Two, there is a 2-bay version of the TS130 that is the RTD1296. Now, a number of you might be thinking, it's only a revision number. What possible? You're being so petty. They're both quad-core 1.4 gigahertz processor. They're both 64-bit ARM-based processor. What possible difference can there be? And there's one particular difference. One, how it handles multimedia at 4K. The transcoding support of that CPU is not quite as good as that of the 64-bit RTD1296, and that small little difference is enough in my eyes to lower it slightly in my esteem, because I don't know why they would go for the lesser revision. Maybe it was availability, maybe shortages, I'm not sure, but the fact that CPU is the lesser version than the 2-bay version, I'm not a big fan of, particularly given the price difference between the 1 and the 2-bay makes you instantly just look at the 2-bay anyway. So the TS130 sort of defeats itself in a number of ways. Ultimately, between all of them, I would say that the best CPU kind of has to go into a tie between that of the DS118 and the TS131K, because both of them have their own kind of priority. The Realtek, great for multimedia and larger file handling, I would say, but again, it's still going to be taxed very, very hard. And the minute you're doing file processes and backups, it will sort of teeter a little bit in a way that although 32-bit ARM there, that quad-core inside the 131K is, not of the same architecture, it's going to be better for frequent backups and file handling of a more general sense. So for me, those are the two best picks there. It's also worth mentioning they all arrive with memory, but with all but one of them arriving with 1 gigabyte of memory. 1 gig of DDR4 in the 118, 1 gig of DDR4 in the TS130, but the two in the middle, there's 1 gig of DDR3 and half a gig of DDR3L. Now, in the case of the 120J, that is really what hobbles this system. Every time I've ever used it here on the channel, I've done videos, I'm always keen to point out that its biggest failing is that memory. None of them can have their memory upgraded, but that one in particular is the one that suffers the most. It bottlenecks largely any process you do on this system. You'll run out of memory long before you run out of CPU power, and it's what really kills it for me. Obviously, the ones with 1 gig of DDR4 are taking the lead there, and again, none of them can be upgraded anyway, but that half a gig, rough, and there's a reason that NAS knocks around for less than 100 notes, you know. Now, in terms of ports and connectivity, all of them arrive with support of 1 gigabit Ethernet, which again, although we've seen innovations from both brands in the hardware architecture of these systems over the last few years, I will state that 1 GBE on a 1-bay NAS is still not really fair these days, because the majority of modern hard drives, and again, I've mentioned this one earlier, this is the WD UltraStar over here, that drive supports 270 megabytes per second in an optimized environment there for sequential read. 1 GBE is going to bottleneck you a maximum of 109 megabytes per second there, which is a real shame. And all of these arriving 1 GBE, I kind of forgive it on the 118. I sort of forgive it on the super cheap 120J. I kind of forgive it on the TS130, but I don't forgive it on the 131K for two reasons. Firstly, because that's the one for file handling. Of all of these four, that one is the one for file handling and maybe light business, maybe another tier to your existing network operations and a backup or a sync tier. I would expect that to have 2.5 GBE gigabit Ethernet, which provides up to 270 megabytes per second in optimal environments. You know, I expect that to have that. QNAP have been really on 2.5 GBE on their modern solutions, and I'm really disappointed that this NAS, arriving at over $200, does not have that. They've all got USB ports, and of course USB 3 is going to be better because you're going for these 1-bays that have no RAID support. So in terms of backing up your storage, you're going to be heavily reliant on backing up to the cloud or synchronizing with the cloud. They've all got software for that in hybrid share and hybrid mount. You're going to be connecting with other remote NASes via real-time remote replication, RTRR, or rsync. Now, you're also going to utilize USB backups. And of all of four of these, the best one is the TS131K. It arrives with 3 USB ports there. So again, all of them are USB 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabits per second connectivity there, but 3 ports there allow multiple backup options, and it even has a one-touch USB backup button there on the front. Very handy for just double checking that that backup's been done there, not just relying on automated connect and it syncs, or which you can still do, or connecting it and then going into the software and actioning it manually. Now, the reason I wanted to call out the TS131K more than any of these other ones, based on that network connection, is QNAP have an adapter. There's an adapter out there that's a USB 3 to 5 gigabit Ethernet adapter, which this device supports. On top of that, there are USB to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet adapters that knock around for about 25 quid. This device should have, at that price point, 2.5 GBE. It's not even that old, okay? So this device not having 2.5 GBE really disappoints me, and although it's still the best one of all four of these for its network connectivity, its potential network connectivity and all those USB ports and the one-touch USB, even if it's got that dippy tray that no one's ever going to use, still nonetheless, I'm disappointed that it doesn't have 2.5 GBE. Obviously, the poorest one of all of them is going to be that 120J. It's got 2 USB 2 ports. It's a 1-bay. I mean, do not trust your data, is what I'm saying on that, okay? Now, one of the other reasons that a lot of people will buy a 1-bay NAS is because it's discreet. It's small, it's quiet, and depending on the drive you buy, because hard drives, as they get bigger in capacity and more enterprise in their architecture, again, utilizing that drive over here, which I'm actually now just going to put close to me, these drives make a lot more noise. The clicks, hums, whirs, spin up, spin down, while they're being read and the actuators are reading those patterns, they make a lot more noise. So although I'm going to talk about noise on these systems, and they're all very, very quiet NASes, it's worth highlighting that in most cases, if you exceed about 8 TB, you're going to hear them throughout the course of this video, you may have heard clicks, hums and whirs just behind this wall here, where I've got a padded wall on the side here. That's 2 NASes that are currently RAID resyncing, and they're populated with 10 and 12 TB drives. That is the kind of noise I'm talking about. I don't know how much of that's coming through. I'll try and leave that in the edit where possible. But with all of these, the quietest of the 4, by a good margin, is that one on the end. The TS130 reported 15.2 dBA populated with a 4 TB drive. It's by far the quietest, and although none of them are not exactly going to rock the sound waves, it's the quietest, largely due to its tiny ball bearing fan inside pushing air vertically and some vents based on the bottom. It's very, very intelligently designed in that way, but of course these sound differences are very, very small, although it takes the point the minute you go to a larger capacity, which a 1 bay is kind of going to make you have to do because you can't rely on RAID. I think noise, although it wins, it doesn't win a massive point there. And the same goes for power consumption. Between all 4 of these, by a country mile, the lowest power one there is the one on the end, the TS130, at a 36 watt external PSU. It's a tiny little PSU there. And the 120, I believe, might even be the same. The 120J might be the same, but we've done power consumption checks, and the 130 is by far the lowest power consumed. But again, all of these are very small NASes, and a number of people out there who look at 1 bays with power consumption concerns in mind are generally people that are on metered metered power connections. They live on like houseboats or mobile homes, and therefore they need something that's going to switch into idle quite a lot. That's very low idle utilization when it's not being accessed. They want something that's not going to drain the battery that much, and although the TS120 by far is the lowest power consumer of the 4, I would argue that the difference between all 4 of them is small enough that I wouldn't use that as a make or break point to buy that 1 bay there. It wins by a country mile, but what that means in the grand scheme of things isn't actually that much. Which brings us to our summary. Which one of these 4 should you buy? Obviously, they do all have different optimized utilization in mind. It's very hard for me to go, ooh, don't buy that one, or whatever. They've all got an end user in mind, and I think throughout this comparison you must have been hearing this and hearing certain things that correspond to your situation, from price to value to power consumption, noise and more. So let me summarize it this way. The DS118 is the best all-round solution. Okay, the software DSM7 runs well on it. It has snapshots. It's got support of 4K transcoding, although that's native, not in Plex, but it does support a myriad and the majority of Synology software there. It also arrives, I think, at the best reasonable balance point there between price and what you're getting in return. Now, in the case of the 120J, yes, it's the budget solution. Yes, it's the solution that you go for when you are on a tight budget and you've already got a hard drive knocking around in a drawer there. But it does support DSM7, and it does support a lot of the lower tier applications from Synology. Yes, you're going to have to wait longer for it to do every job, and yes, you can pretty much remove any kind of multi-user or multi-task situation given that limited memory, but it's easily the budget choice. And by budget, I mean super budget. Just don't expect miracles, okay? Now, the TS131K, that for me, if you're a business user, is the one you should go for. It's got the best file handling of all of them there. It's got the 3 USB ports that allow you to not only attach a USB 3 based backup drive, but then you can also utilize those adapters that allow better network connection. So you could introduce this into a wider switch at 2.5 GBE, and therefore there's going to be a lot more bandwidth to be shared by all your connected users on that network. On top of that, those USB ports can be used for Wi-Fi 6. They can be utilized for all manner of different things, all of which are possible on that device, along with the one-touch backup, along with the USB backups, and along with the network upgrade options as well. And finally, there on the end, the TS130 is the quiet, it's the discreet, it's the subtle NAS that you can set up and forget and walk away from. It's the one that will blend in and you won't have to keep checking on. So if you're looking for a nice, subtle set up and forget, be it as another step into your backup routine, and it's just synchronizing with your NAS, you wanted to add another tier, it's a good option to go for, and it's the one you're going to notice the least out of the 4 of these in terms of noise, in terms of power consumption, and overall impact on your network and hardware environment. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, click like, it helps me understand. And if you want to learn more, click subscribe. There's a link to the full breakdown and comparison with all the specifications in the description over on NAS Compare, so I do recommend you check that out. And of course, do take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares. I will see you next time.